Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'll have to make one correction. I haven't been to every county in Texas. I'm still missing about 10 of the 254 counties. There are a few of them down, mostly in the lower Rio Grande Valley, between McAllen and Eagle Pass. And then there's 2 out in West Texas, but I plan to get those before too much longer. I was delighted to hear about, a lot of the history here in Grapevine, and the fact that you've got your own newsletter, and Mayor Tate writes an article for that. From what I understand, Mayor Tate is the history of Grapevine. But speaking of newsletters, I happen to edit the newsletter for the Texas Map Society. I've been doing that for over a decade now. And I encourage all of you who have any interest in maps at all, just go online to Texas Map Society. If you just do a Google search for Texas Map Society, you'll find it. It'll take you to our homepage, and you can look at the newsletter, the current one that was posted in April. The next issue will be in September. We usually have one in the spring, one in the fall. And so I encourage you to do that. Think about joining the Texas Map Society. We have generally 2 meetings a year. The fall meeting is typically here at UTA in special collections, and the spring meeting moves around from place to place. In the spring it was in Houston. And I encourage all of you to, who have this interest and passion for history, to look into that. We could use some more new blood in there as well. I have a lot of different interests. History, Texas history in particular. One of my wife's ancestors was one of Stephen F. Austin's old 300. They settled in southern Brazos County, the Millicans. And in fact, if you go down there south of College Station, you'll find a little community called Millican. And some of their headstones are there in the cemetery. Now, they had 15,000 acres of land, not far from Washington on the Brazos. It was on the other side in Brazos County. But not 1 acre of that came down through Sherry's family. It all went somewhere else. So we were driving down there once. We went to the Washington on the Brazos State Park, which if you've never done, you need to. It's fascinating. And we drove through the area that was her family's history and picked up a rock, and she said, "That's my inheritance." So that's sitting on a shelf in our library. But I do have this love of history, of maps, and of weather. This kind of combines all of those. This is a weather map from 1873. Now I'm going to pass this around. We'll start here. We maybe just go back and forth down this side and then go back up the other side and end up over here. But 1873, and you'll notice a lot of blank spots on there. There was no such thing as a weather map until the invention of the telegraph, because there was no way to have instantaneous recordings of weather at multiple locations. You could tell somebody what the weather had been like days or weeks before, but you could not have a weather map showing simultaneous weather observations until we had the telegraph. And the telegraph didn't cover the entire country, but you'll see on this map the different locations that were reporting. So just pass that around and look at it as we're talking. I guess we're ready to begin, Larry.
Yeah. You've got the remote there, right?
Oh.
Let me know what you want me to do with the mic.
I think it's okay.
And everyone can hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. This is our station, and you can tell it's old just by look.
Can we move the podium first on this?
Oh, okay. My hands are kind of full.
Now can y'all see okay now? Okay.
Okay, if you look at the vehicles in the parking lot, You can kind of guess the age of this. This building was built in 1948, and as I mentioned earlier, the first station in Texas was actually the first one between the Mississippi River and California. We had had a few other stations on the East Coast, of course, New York, Washington, Chicago, LA, but we were the first one in the entire central part of the country. And so in 1948, no one really knew what a television studio was supposed to look like. So if this looks kind of familiar, they took the design, the architectural designs, from a middle school of the era. And you'll see, if you go back and look at some 1940s schools in Fort Worth, they look a lot like that. What they did was inside, they turned the auditorium and cafeteria spaces into studios. And even to this day, if you were to go upstairs, you will see a long hallway with classrooms off on either side. That was where we had the managers and the sales staff and so forth. All the news was downstairs. But that, I go back to 1975. I worked in that building for a long time, but I wasn't there when it began. I'll tell you one person who was Bobby Wygant. And those of you who have been around forever, she jokes that she was poured in with the foundation. But she was there age 21, she started. And she was still doing entertainment reports for us up until about 6 or 7 years ago. She's now in her mid-90s, and she has written a book. Oh, she did speak to you. Okay, good. So, because I wanted to bring that to your attention also. It shows a lot of the history.
Where is that located? What's the address?
It's, okay. The location is in East Fort Worth, what we call Broadcast Hill. And yeah, if you drive down there, I don't know if you see the Channel 11 studio is right there on I-30. We were across 30. If you look the other direction, you'll see some towers back up there. It is now being used, that building is being used by the Fort Worth Police Department and communications hub for them, because it does have a lot of high-tech equipment inside. But again, we did start with this newsreel.
When a B-29 bomber crashed and burned near Fort Worth a few weeks ago, it was a routine job of coverage for the WBAP TV staff which produces the Texas News. A 5 days a week television newsreel covering top news events of Fort Worth, Dallas, and Texas. In peace and war, the aim of the Texas News since it was established on September 29, 1948, has been the development of a new medium of news, television.
That was a promo, obviously, but it was the same type of thing we saw on the air, because we used the newsreel. You didn't see an anchor sitting at the desk talking to you. It was just the videos. It wasn't video, it was film back then. And then you would have a narrator who was just sitting in an audio booth reading over that. And that's the way it was for the first mostly a decade or so before it transitioned to a little closer to what we see today. This is from the early 50s. If those of you who have been around a long time may remember, this isn't the only hot and dry summer we've had. The early to mid 50s was the worst drought we've ever had here in North Texas. And it was plenty hot too. It usually gets hotter when it's dry. And this is a story that did air at that time.
You want to read the script or shall I?
Oh, okay. I thought it was recorded on here.
No.
Okay. Not only mad dogs and Englishmen, but attractive airline hostesses venture out in the noonday sun at Love Field in Dallas, and after a scientific scrutinizing of conditions, decide to prove for the camera that it has been literally hot enough to fry an egg on an airport runway. Some things never change. Our breakfast-minded bathing beauties, all American Airlines employees, are Joanne Nelson, Jackie Kassler, Lois Happenin, and Ann Mosley. This little drama admittedly won't help end the heat wave, but it's nice to know that even in one of the hottest spots in the Fort Worth, Dallas area, a sun-baked airport runway, you may find some pleasant company to take your mind off the brutal temperatures. 4 Fort Worth residents were a heat problem all their own. These Eskimo Spitz puppies owned by Mrs. Hayworth of the Poly section. The world may not owe them a living, but at least the world owes them cooler climate by virtue of their far north origin. These little guys from up Alaska way catch on quickly and see the benefits of a civilized gadget. However, if it comes to a choice, these pups will take an igloo every time. Now, obviously, this is very dated. You'd never get scripts like that on the air now about all the bathing beauties. We've come a long way, but the stories don't change. We still have plenty of heat now. Now, when the weather started, Harold Taft, and you can see him right here at a very young age, back when he was in his 20s. He had been in the Air Force during World War II, came back and got a job with American Airlines as a meteorologist, forecasting the weather for their pilots. And on a whim, one day he dropped by the TV station and said, "I have an idea. We give weather briefings to the pilots every day. How about we do something like that on the news?" There had never been a weather broadcast anywhere in the country other than somebody who was just reading the actual forecast off the teletype that came from the National Weather Service. But no one had ever used weather maps on television. Harold was the original of that. And since he had a full-time job with American Airlines, he couldn't be here every night. So he and 2 other American airline pilots joined up, and whoever was not on duty at American Airlines would come out and do the weather. And that persisted through the 50s. In the early 60s, I believe it was, American Airlines moved all their meteorologists to LA. And Harold decided not to go. And he stayed and went full-time for Channel 5. The other 2 did move to Los Angeles. But you can see the beginnings of weather maps with the lows, the highs, a cold front. Here, explaining the moisture coming in from the Gulf and then riding up, doing a scientific explainer showing the lift that is produced as it moves inland. And just a chalkboard forecast here. Now, this was the logo early on, the Weather Telefax, and it was the logo Weather Telefax, WBAP, Channel 5, and then the background here was our radar. Channel 5 was also the first television station ever to have its own radar. This was a WSR 57, that means Weather Service Radar from 1957, that vintage. And this is what we still had when I started at the tail end of 1975. And you would watch the sweep go around and it would go blip if there was rain, a cathode ray tube. You would get this little flare up of a bright spot, and then as the sweep is going around, it would fade away. So you didn't see anything moving like you do now. You don't see any motion like Doppler radars show. You don't have any detail really. There's no cities on the map. You just have the range rings so you can plot out where they are in relation to the site of the radar. It was very rudimentary, but it was a first. And when you go up on the roof at Channel 5, this is what you would see. There's Harold pointing out that very first radar. And again, he was just a broadcast pioneer. Here's inside the studio, and again, this had changed by the time I got there. We didn't use quite this kind of graphics. Notice the Worth Food Mart advertisement up at the top. One thing we did still have was the weather dials off on the left side, where we would pan down and see the temperature and humidity and pressure and so forth. And here's just a little video about those early days.
Weather telefax. Here is your staff meteorologist, Harold Taft.
Good evening, folks. Under clear skies, the present temperature is 82 degrees, and we look for a hot day tomorrow. It was 91 in Fort Worth, 93 in Dallas. Temperatures tomorrow should be up into the middle 90s, downtown areas, some places even warmer than that. Cooler air, however, is pushing down across northwestern Oklahoma, and radar picked up a line of thunderstorms about 30 minutes ago.
But you could see him pointing out on those paper maps there, and those were the kind of maps we used when I started. I was hired in, it was December of 1975. This is my very first promo shoot in January of 76. So I had just been there a couple of weeks. I graduated from Texas A&M in May of 75. Spent that summer doing field research up in Alaska on the Juneau ice field, planning on a career in research. Came back. I had a full fellowship at Texas A&M for my master's program. They were paying me to go to school. And after being up in Alaska, coming back and sitting in a classroom again was just kind of stultifying. I was at that point where I was ready to get on with my life. And I got this phone call one day from Harold Taft, who I'd never heard of. I grew up in Houston. But he said that he had seen my application at the National Weather Service. Back at that time, when you filled out the civil service applications, there was a little box you could check if you would allow your form to be released to any other local agency or person interested. And sure enough, as a graduating college student, you're going to consider anything. So I checked that box, and what Harold did was he went down to the Fort Worth Weather Service headquarters downtown and went through a bunch of applications and invited 4 or 5 of us to come interview. And, you know, he wouldn't have invited anyone who wasn't qualified. Number one, he wanted a degree in meteorology and, you know, a strong academic background. And I was one of those that he chose. So how did he pick me? Well, it took a while for me to figure that out. I'm going to sidestep just a little bit and go back to my interview with Harold. I came up, you know, I was attending classes full-time during the week. I came up on a Saturday morning. Those paper maps we drew, at the end of each newscast, they were torn off and thrown away because you had to draw a new one for the next show. But they had left the ones up from Saturday night, or from Friday night, because they knew they had some interviewers coming in on Saturday. And so I came out and was expecting a long, involved interview, and he said, you know, I was looking at your transcript, you know, you did very well in school. I don't really have any questions there. We just need to see you in front of the camera. So he marched me right into the studio. I sat down at a chair on the anchor desk, which was up on a little raised platform, and sat there, and the camera comes on. Hello, I'm David Finfrock. Let's take a look at the Texas map. Push the chair back, not gauging very carefully how far it was to the drop-off on the back of that raised platform. And so my chair is toppling over. I scrambled to my feet. Fortunately, I didn't go over with it, but you hear this loud crash in the background as it hits. And I walked on over to where the maps were and did my demonstration. We had the little pointers at the time. I would point out stuff on the map and discuss it, come back. Fortunately, one of the floor crew had set the chair back up, so I didn't have to do that myself. Sat down, signed off, and said, well, that's the shortest TV career in history. I better go back and redouble my efforts for my master's degree. And I was just floored when a month later Harold called offering me the job. I thought, my interview had been a disaster. And it was a year or two after that when I got up the nerve to ask him, why did you choose me after that happened? And Harold said, well, the fact that you had that occur and you didn't say, stop, can we start over? He said, I just rolled with it, went on, did the job, came back. He said, if you could do that on your interview, we think you can handle anything that'll come up on live television. So that little disaster turned out to be the thing that started my career here. And it's been almost 50 years now. But that was December 22nd of 75 was my first, that was my first day at the station. And like I said earlier, I worked there for a week or so drawing maps, but not going on the air. Ron Godby was doing the weather in the mornings at that time, Harold Taft, of course, in the evenings, and he was also doubling up on the noon show because Ron had a legal practice as well. But I was drawing maps, had been doing that for about a week, and here it is noon, that first week of January, and we go to the commercial break before weather, and I'm expecting Harold to go on, and he hands me the pointer and says, why don't you do it today? I had a 2-minute warning that I was going to make my television debut. And I've had some people in here tell me they remember seeing that. I'm always embarrassed when I hear that, but evidently I did okay. Really, it was a blessing the way Harold did that, because if he had told me, all right, tomorrow we're going to put you on the air, the whole previous night I would have been thinking about it and worrying, what could go wrong. And here I had 2 minutes to, put on the microphone, get that pointer, get in position, and then it was time to go. And I've been doing it now, like I said, in December of this year, it'll be 48 years. I keep hoping that maybe I can keep going part-time till I get to 50. That's kind of my goal right now. Like I said, some things don't change.
Degrees. The hottest day of the year so far. But Texans are used to this kind of heat. In Dallas, Parkland Hospital has reported only a handful of heat stroke cases in the last 3 weeks. And at John Peter Smith Hospital in Fort Worth, the news is even more encouraging. No heat stroke cases and only a few patients with the less serious heat exhaustion. Nothing at all unusual for a Texas summer. But of course, the hazard does still exist, especially for the elderly or those with breathing or circulation difficulties. Many of the area's young people are cooling off in swimming pools, and Fort Worth's water gardens are popular in spite of the official no swimming rules. It's back up above 100 degrees again today, and the bad news is it's only June. And as any long-time Texan can tell you, the worst is yet to come in July and August. I'm David Finfrock, Channel 5 Action News at the Fort Worth Water Gardens.
Yeah, that was one of my first live shots. The very first one I had done when it hit 113 on June 27th and 28th of 1980. 113 degrees, and that was at the Handley Power Plant in East Fort Worth. And I'm standing out there talking about how much energy is being used for air conditioning. And that was my debut live shot outside during the evening newscast. Mostly I was doing the mornings and the noon weather. Now, one day, after doing my morning and noon routine, I was getting ready to go to bed. It was almost 10 o'clock, and I got a panicked phone call from the TV station. And they said, David, can you come in? Harold has just gone to the hospital. He had a heart attack. And it's 9:45 Now, fortunately, I lived on the east side. It was about a 5-minute drive to the station. But I hurriedly threw on a suit, drove to the station, got there just before 10 o'clock, threw a map up on the wall, and used Harold's forecast that he had prepared earlier. And Harold was in for the next 6 weeks in the hospital after having, I believe it was a triple bypass surgery. So after doing that morning and noon show, I came back in and did the 10. The next morning I was back in, getting up at 4:30 in the morning, going in to do the morning and the noon and the 5 and the 6 and the 10. And I did that on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. At that time, I was also working 6 days a week because I did Monday through Friday mornings and noon, and I did Saturday evenings. And so then I also had to work the Saturday show. Now, fortunately, the following week, we got somebody to come in and handle the early morning. But for the next 6 weeks, I did noon, 5, 6, and 10. And it was, pretty back-breaking schedule for me. And at the end of that time, they actually gave me an extra month's pay because I had done so many extra jobs. But they also recognized that 2 meteorologists wasn't enough. And that's when Scott Chesner was hired, who you see there on the right. And so this is me and Harold and Scott back in the early 80s. And some of the people behind us there are weather watchers from the era. We had yearly programs where they would come out to the station and we'd put on a weather presentation for them. Now this is the Action News era. When I was actually hired, it was still the Texas News. And I mentioned working 6 days a week. That's because I was hired by Harold Taft. I wasn't hired by WBAP, or at that point it was KXAS. It changed from WBAP to KXAS in 1974, the year before I arrived. And at that point, they had a contract with Harold Taft to provide all the weather services for the station. And then he hired people to do the shifts that he couldn't cover. And so that's why he was looking for people straight out of college who would work cheap. That's also why for the first 2.5 years I was there, I got a monthly check from Harold E. Taft and Associates. I had no health insurance. I had no paid vacation. I had no sick leave. I worked 6 days a week, but it got my foot in the door. And 2.5 years later, I had a new news director come in, and he found out that if he wanted to get rid of me, he couldn't fire me because I didn't work for him. I worked for Harold Taft. So that is when they actually worked a contract where I got paid by the station. So although I have been there since '75, my years of service with the company start in '78. Before that, I was basically a freelancer. But then in the '80s, it transitioned to Action News.
From KXAS TV, this is Channel 5 Action News.
Good evening, I'm Dennis Hulley. Hurricane Allen has gone ashore near Brownsville. We have word from meteorologists that tornadoes, high winds, and heavy seas have pushed water inland and caused a great deal of destruction in the Brownsville area. Action News reporter Charles Ely is standing by, we understand, live from Corpus Christi. Charles?
Can we get rid of the feedback? Thank you.
You're on.
Okay. And I'm Charles Ely.
And I'm Harold Taft, and we're live in Corpus Christi. Hurricane winds extend 75 miles to the north and about 50 miles to the south. So that's pretty much the situation that we're in right here. Now, the temperature is holding pretty steady at 77, and that may sound comfortable, especially with the wind blowing 64 miles an hour. But the humidity is 90% right now, and that, of course, makes it a very, very miserable night. Exactly what does the rain look like, and what does it feel like when we're up to 65 miles an hour? Well, it's stinging right up against your face, believe me. David, that's the latest we have from Corpus Christi.
All right, Harold, we got a good look at the storm from our eye in the sky, of course. The satellite photo shows the big sprawling mass stationary there just off of Brownsville. If we look at that right now, you can see the big cloud zone and very clearly see the eye of the storm there just off of Brownsville. It will be moving, of course, right on up the Rio Grande. Flash flood watches out throughout all of South Texas. A tornado watch also from McAllen on up towards Victoria. We've already had one report of a tornado in the Freer area, tornado warning there in Duval County, and there will likely be more as the storm sits there spawning the very severe weather all along the Texas coast. In our area, already some high clouds beginning to move in. Now, we'll take a look at the forecast map for tomorrow, and on it you can see, again, fair and hot out west. But in our area, the rain increasing quite a bit. It will be moving onshore very slowly during the next 24, 36 hours, drifting up the Rio Grande, and by tomorrow evening, we should begin to see some of the rain beginning to move up into our area. We won't have the torrential rains they've had down south, but we will see scattered showers and thunderstorms Sunday evening on through Monday and Tuesday. So a couple of days of a chance for some pretty good showers in our area.
David, did you have, I know those were maps, but did you have a green screen off?
Not at this point. That came later. No, it was a paper satellite photo we got off of the DIFAX chart. Facsimile machine, and it would come off, we rip it, take it in, tape it up on a wall, and they took a picture of it with the camera. And it was, and other times, I would actually stand in front of it and point, but no, we didn't have a green screen at that point. That came a little bit later. This is some of the crew back at that time. Most of the newsroom and engineering, all the people who put the news on, the floor crew. Here you can see Dave Lehman and Jane Giroux were the main anchors. We had Scott Murray doing sports, Brad Wright and Angela Kane were doing the 5 and the 6. Lee Elsesser, Bill Hicks did a lot of the morning shift with me, and there I am in the middle. So a lot of very talented people. A lot of experience. Things have changed though. The maps are a little bit different. I don't have to, at the top of the newscast, go rip off the teletype the temperatures that are coming in from across the country and go in and draw on the paper map with marker and using pastel chalk to outline the areas of precipitation. Now everything is done electronically. Just so much of an increase in technology. And here I am posing with Rick. We've got our 75th anniversary at Channel 5 coming up this fall. In all that time, we've had 3 chief meteorologists. Harold Taft, me, and now Rick Mitchell. And so, that kind of longevity is just unheard of elsewhere. A lot of stations will have a new person in every 3 or 4 years, but not us. Thank you.
It's now being confirmed that we've got rotation within that cloud. Official storm spotters out there are observing rotation. We've had no tornado touchdown, but a tornado warning has now been issued here in northern Tarrant County. Oh, all right, look at this. This is a live picture, and we do seem to have a tornado right in downtown Fort Worth right now. Our camera is being shaken. You can see the debris flying through the air. This is a live picture from the top of a building in downtown Fort Worth, and you can see the swirling debris in the storm. This is incredible. We have a tornado live in downtown Fort Worth. Everyone in Tarrant County, take cover immediately. This is a very dangerous storm. It's moving to the east. Now you can see here it appears to be letting up at the moment. You don't see as much of the debris flying, at least, but there you can still see lightning flashing in the buildings. A very dangerous storm. There could be more than one tornado out of this cell. We're going to continue to watch it here. This is just incredible video.
David, have you ever seen anything like this?
I have never seen a tornado live.
And what was interesting about that, if you know where downtown Fort Worth is and where our TV station was there, off of Oakland Boulevard and 30 Broadcast Hill, we were just about 3.5 miles as the crow flies from that tornado, which was moving east. So after covering this for another minute or so, I said, all right, I've got to run outside. I ran out on the front porch because I needed to find out, is there a tornado coming down right towards the station? Do I need to send everybody to the basement? And I looked and I could see swirling clouds, but there was no longer a funnel. So I was able to go back in and continue the broadcast. But that was really a historic event, March 28th of 2000. Well, there wasn't a person. That was a camera that's just mounted on top of the building in downtown Fort Worth. There was nobody up there. But here we are, I mentioned the satellite photo coming off the DIFAX charts. Well, this is the same with all of these weather maps. And we would pull those off. We had to put in, about every day or two, had to put in a new roll of that ammonia paper that would print out these maps. And you can see all of these different weather maps, the surface maps, upper level maps, forecast from the very rudimentary computer models of the time. But again, this ties in my interest of weather and maps. And the maps took me, in another direction. My first real love came from my father, who was a geologist, and he had all sorts of maps at home, and I would spend an evening sitting there with the National Geographic Atlas just going through it and studying it. And when we drove around the country, we would stop at road cuts and look for fossils and minerals and so forth. So I got a love of the geosciences from an early age. And then it was in 1961 when Hurricane Carla hit. And remember, I told you earlier I was growing up in Houston. That made a big impact on me. And that's when I really focused in on weather. And so I was, 8 years old at the time. And that's, from that time on, I knew I wanted to be a meteorologist. And here I am, actually a meteorologist, standing there with the maps that I love. And there's one of the old paper maps that I still have a couple of them stashed under my bed. And you can see the little red arrow showing the wind flow coming up. In the east, the yellow and orange area is pastel chalk outlining an area of fog. And the hatched green came off of the radar imagery from the DIFAX charts and shows just the general area of rain. And so you can see, how far we have come, where we can have storms in motion that you can dissect and look at them in so much detail now digitally. Yes, ma'am.
Did you write on that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's one of my maps. I did take a drafting course in high school, which came in handy. But you can see me holding up that map. If you look carefully on the wall back behind, a whole bunch of other maps. The very first antique map that I purchased was a Texas map, a Colton map of Texas from the 1860s. And I got that at a bookshop in Williamsburg, Virginia when we were on vacation there. And there was another map that I really loved, but I couldn't really justify spending the money for it. And then I came home and Sherry saw how much I regretted it, leaving it. And so she encouraged me to just order it. And I'm ahead of myself. These are some more of the Texas maps. I'll get back to that first and second map momentarily, but these are some Texas maps that I've also donated to UTA. And what's interesting here, this is from the 1870s, is that purple oval down here. It says Texas and Arkansas maps. And Henry Hannon, Land and Immigration Agent, Swan Creek, Ohio. So he was somebody who was promoting immigration to Texas from the eastern states. And I was able to get some of his correspondence, which I donated to UTA, and also his business card. So Henry Hannon, Texas Land Locator. And then here's another map, again, with his stamp on the right. But I did donate those to UTA also. I have a bunch of other maps at home still, but some of them will probably wind up at UTA eventually. But then back to Antarctica. This has been one of my loves since, I was a teenager, and I read Endurance by Alfred Lansing. If you've never read it, check it out. I'm sure they have a copy here in the library. It's the story of Ernest Shackleton. Shackleton is one of my all-time exploration heroes. And he and James Cook, Captain Cook. Shackleton was simply amazing in the decisions he made to keep his crew safe. On his first expedition, this was 2 years before Scott and Amundsen made it to the South Pole. He came within 80 miles of the South Pole. I mean, he was like a 4 or 5 day march from getting there and being in the history books as the first person ever to reach the South Pole. And he looked at the rations and he said, time to turn around and go back. 80 miles away. Everyone made it back safely. 2 years later, Amundsen made it first. Robert Scott, made it about 2 weeks after Amundsen did. On the way back, a blizzard came through. They got cornered in their tent for almost a week, ran out of provisions, and everyone on Scott's team died. Shackleton didn't make it first, but everybody lived. Then there is, this one here, the Endurance. That's the story I was telling you about Alfred Lansing's book. The Endurance is the name of the book, as well as the name of the ship itself. And this time, this was in the mid-teens, Shackleton planned not just to go to the South Pole, but to cross the Antarctic continent. Instead of going out and back, he wanted to go all the way across. And so he was coming in from the opposite direction, and from south of South Africa, rather than coming in south from New Zealand. And his ship got frozen in the ice. They're stuck there. This is before we had radio contact from that kind of a distance. They had no way to communicate with the outside world. They're stuck in the ice, can't move anywhere. They're in Antarctica with winter coming on. And, you would think, well, all hope is over. Their ship got crushed by the ice as it shifted around. And there's some really interesting videos that you can search for on the web. Just, I think it was the year before last, they found the Endurance down on the bottom, and it's just in pristine condition, sort of like the Titanic, but nobody died getting to see it. But at any rate, here they are in Antarctica, no way to communicate with the outside world. Their ship is crushed. Right? Death sentence, right? They take those lifeboats that are up there, lower them down. The men drag them over the ice for 100 miles or more to where they can reach some water. And then they sail a distance to Elephant Island, and they set up a little base camp there. There, at least, there are seals and penguins, and they can subsist on that since they were almost out of the food that they had brought with them. They take one of those boats, rig a sail for it, and then he takes off across the stormiest ocean on Earth from Elephant Island in the South Shetlands going to South Georgia, where they knew there was a whaling station. And 800 miles, dead reckoning, no navigation other than, taking sightings of the stars and so forth. They made it to South Georgia, amazingly enough, but they're on the west side. The whaling station is on the east side of the island with a huge mountain range in between them. If they try to sail around, the current's just going to sweep them out towards Africa, and they're all going to perish. So they don't have tents or anything, so they have to cross the island, and they have to do it in one day. An area that no one had ever seen before. It was the very first time. They hiked up into the mountains. It's getting dark as they're starting the descent on the other side, and running out of other options. They put a blanket down, hooked their arms around each other, and tobogganed down this snow slope, not knowing what's beyond. I mean, there could have been a 1,000-foot drop-off, but they made it down. They made it back to the whaling station. They were able to get another ship, sail back to Elephant Island, collect all his crew. They all came back. Everyone on board survived. Shackleton was just amazing. Now, unfortunately, they got back in about, to England in about 1915, and about half of the men did die in World War I. But, Shackleton was just amazing. My all-time exploration hero.
There's a great show on the History Channel about that.
Yeah, I really encourage anyone interested in history to read up on Shackleton. Okay, that's my introduction on what really got me interested in Antarctica per se, and the exploration and history of Antarctica. And so I mentioned earlier that second map that I bought, and this is it, a chart of the southern hemisphere showing the tracks of the most distinguished navigators by Captain James Cook. So that is Captain Cook's map from the 1770s. And if you look, here's South America, here's Africa, Australia up here, there's the South Pole, and you don't see any land. If you look closely, you can see the tracks that he took all the way around. He was the first to cross the Antarctic Peninsula. The Antarctic Circle. He got farther south than anyone ever had, but he never saw any land other than a few islands, which he discovered, but never saw an Antarctic continent. But that is, a really historic map and one of the hallmarks of my Antarctic collection. But I got a lot more over the years, most of them off of eBay. It's amazing what you can find there. But that's still hanging on the wall in our dining room. I told Ben he'll get it someday, but right now that one I'm still keeping. But Ben took that photo when he came out to our house to see the collection for the first time. Here's another map just in general showing the Antarctic. I've got a lot better ones than that. This is just a simple National Geographic map, but it highlights the areas that research stations are located at. And if you look at the shirt I'm wearing there, this was at my presentation at UTA, and you can see I've got an Antarctic map on my shirt too. This one Ben and I are holding is one of my favorite maps. It's from the Byrd Antarctic expedition in the early 1930s. At that point, they had made it to the South Pole, but most of Antarctica was still unexplored. And so this is very interesting because the map came along with the South Pole Radio News, published by Grape Nuts, the cereal that Bird took to Little America. But, I mean, this was a real promotional item by General Mills. They, published these bird newsletters, and here you can see a little closer up version of that Antarctic map. And I just love this one. It's not nearly as old as some of the others I have, but the colors, the graphics are just really interesting. I especially like the little penguins down here holding up a banner that says unexplored. Most of Antarctica was unexplored, and really until the advent of satellite imagery, we didn't know exactly what Antarctica looked like. We were getting more and more focus on the outer boundaries, but most of the interior was completely unknown. I told you I was fascinated by Antarctica, and mentioned earlier that I've been to all 7 continents. On the year of my 50th birthday, I went to Antarctica and made the crossing from Ushuaia and Tierra del Fuego down to the Antarctic Peninsula. That's another story. But here you can see some of our experiences, a bunch of Gentoo penguins, the glaciers. On the far left are tents set up on shore. We got to spend one night camping on shore in Antarctica instead of on the ship we were on. And that was a fascinating experience. My roommate, Sherry, didn't go. She has real seasickness problems, and that crossing was tough. But my roommate on board was from Wales. He had a real dry sense of humor. We spent the night in that tent. His first words when we got up in the morning was, "Well, thank God that's over." Where was his sense of adventure? I mean, we had just spent the night in Antarctica. I was so thrilled. But you can see by my expression there how excited I was to be in Antarctica. And oh, yes. Let me go back. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, in the top center, that's the Vernadsky base. It's a Ukrainian research station in Antarctica. Originally, it had been a British station, and they were closing it, and Ukraine took it. There are probably 20 different countries that have research stations in Antarctica. There's no permanent population, no civilian population other than the research scientists. One time, this was, I think, in the 90s, the nation of Chile sent a plane down to Antarctica with a pregnant woman on board to deliver a baby. So in Antarctica, to say this was a Chilean citizen and an Antarctic resident, and trying to use that to bolster their territorial claims. So that's the only person who has ever been a native of Antarctica, and I think that child was there for a couple of days. And then there on the left is the first time I actually set foot on the continent. We made several landfalls each day coming in our zodiacs, and I went to a number of islands offshore, but this was the first time I actually was on the mainland of Antarctica. And after all that time, we're sailing back, and we spent about 10 days in Antarctica and then sailed back across the Drake Passage. And this last picture is of me at the end of that trip coming up on Cape Horn. And I have never seen an ocean, outside of it, a protected bay, an open ocean, that flat. And I mean, it was sunny, it was delightful. We're sitting there at Cape Horn, and I'm thinking, how many ships are below us down there? Because you think about how many ships were lost rounding the Cape. And we just had extraordinary weather there. So I especially thank Sherry for telling me go for it, for your 50th birthday celebration. And we have, 75 years for Channel 5, coming up on our 46th wedding anniversary. So, let's see. There's a blooper reel. Do you want to go ahead and play that now? I don't know how people are doing on time.
Let's go back to Channel 5 one more time.
Okay, tomorrow. Now how about that? Somehow or other we just flat missed tomorrow. But let me tell you what'll happen. There will be showers right down in this zone, right in through here. Who ran off with my tomorrow map anyway? Well, that's where they'll be, right down into this area, and they'll be scattered. And I hope if you're worried about the flood, somebody else gets the rain tomorrow. Okay, outside, it's overcast. The wind is out of the north and blowing with a speed of about 10 miles an hour. Whoever stole that map, bring it back. I need it.
I'm glad you did that. You don't have to do anything tomorrow. Harold has officially declared there will be no more tomorrow.
It's been really wet across North Texas, but we got a little peek at the sun this evening. A pretty sunset shot here. Let me try that one again. A pretty sunset. One more time. A pretty sunset shot. Now we don't even have it anymore. Well, thanks to Mark DeGarmo. It was a nice shot all the same. Today we started out at 71.
Thanks for joining us. Have a good day and a happy Thanksgiving.
This has been Channel 5 News Today, honored by both the Associated Press and the United Press International as the best newscast in Texas. Join us again at noon, 5, 6, and 10 for the latest news, weather, and sports.
Okay, I think that's it. So. Now that sunset shot was particularly embarrassing when I messed it up the second time. I just wanted to open it up for any questions about maps or about the Antarctic or about television or about the weather in general. So anybody have a question? Yes?
Is this a field that you're seeing more and more people go into?
Over the years, we have, and in particular, more women. Because when I started, in my graduating class, there was one female, but that was very unusual. Most of the classes were entirely male-dominated. And now it's almost 50-50, whether you're talking about television or the National Weather Service. Female scientists are just doing a heck of a job. And the number of people in the business is kind of limited by the number of jobs available, because there aren't, it's not like, lawyer, you can just set up shop somewhere and go into business for yourself. There's only a limited number of jobs. So some people get a meteorology degree and then wind up doing something else because they can't find a job. So there is a little problem there, but for the really well-qualified people, it's still a wonderful career.
Is A&M the place to go, or are there other places as well?
There are a lot of good schools. Probably the top ones in the country are University of Oklahoma, Texas A&M, Florida State, Penn State. Those are the four, I think, that are premier, but there are a lot of other good schools elsewhere. At our station, Rick went to the University of Nebraska. Grant Johnston went to the University of Missouri. I don't remember where Adrian went. I've only met her a couple of times. Samantha Davies went to the State University of New York in Oneonta, upstate New York. And so there are a number of other schools, and you can get a good education at all of them, but those first four I mentioned are probably the top ones for graduating meteorologists. Yes, sir?
Yeah, so I know you mentioned your Antarctic maps and your Texas maps. Any other areas of interest in cartography, or is there?
Well, Texas and the Southwest, which basically includes, the whole Gulf of Mexico region and going out through the Southwest. I have some, hemispheric or global maps. One of my earliest is an Ortelius map from the late 1500s. And it's mind-boggling to hold in your hands a piece of paper that was printed, almost 450 years ago. That is really, an amazing experience. Thinking, I've got to take care of this. I'm the current holder of this map, but we want it to go on, and that's why a lot of real good maps do end up in places like the UTA Cartographic Library in their special collections, because they will preserve it. Yeah, in the back.
I was going to ask, how did they make maps back in the 15th century?
In the 1500s, some of the earliest ones were woodcuts. If you look at books from the time, or illustrations in early Bibles and so forth, they were woodcuts. They would, carve a design into wood, ink the surface, and then press it down, just like you would press type. And so the earliest ones were woodcut, and then you got copper engravings, where they had a sheet of copper and they would cut out the lines, soak it with ink, and then wipe the ink off the surface, so the only ink left is what's down in the engraved portion. And then again, you force the printing press, the paper, down into those grooves, and you get the map. And the copper engravings were the main source of maps through the 1600s and most of the 1700s. Once we got to the 19th century, you started getting lithographs for the first time. And yeah, right. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the history store in San Antonio?
The history
store.
store.
Across the street from the Alamo gift shop.
Okay, I don't think I've been there. I mean, I've been to the Bob Bullock Museum, which is wonderful. They have a gift shop too. I have been to the Alamo, of course. I don't remember that history shop.
Well, it's full of old maps, and it's not very well known. It's been about 6 or 7 years since we were there. I've bought several things from them, but you might want to plan it. Well, first, make sure it's still there.
Well, I am at that point where I really am no longer collecting maps. I did a lot of that in the 90s and the 2000s, and now I'm at the point where I'm thinking, all right, who is going to take care of these maps for the next generation? And so, like I say, I've been donating a lot to UTA. I used to think, well, this will be a good way, in my retirement to have some income. I can put them back up on eBay and sell them. But you never know, who's going to wind up with them and how well they'll be taken care of. So, I may sell some of the collection, but much of it, I think, is going to be donated. And I've got, a couple of hundred Texas maps. Some of them, dating back to the earliest maps, and then other new ones that just came out of geography books from the late 1800s. They're just a little map that came out of a book, and it's probably not worth more than $10, but it's just preserving a part of history, and that's what I really enjoy. Anybody else? One more at the back first.
The Navy had an outfit called VX6. They used to go to Antarctica like 6 months of the year.
Oh, Operation Deep Freeze.
Yeah, do they still go, or what did they do now?
The Navy provides the support for all of the research that goes on. They have the icebreakers, they have the Coast Guard and Navy, and they have icebreakers to force their way to the coast. They bring ships in with the cargo to support the bases. They have flights from New Zealand to Antarctica also. So, the military is very involved in the logistics and helping set up different stations. But they are run, the research is all run by civilians, mostly university scientists from all across the country doing biological research, glaciological research, drilling down into lakes that are underneath the ice, searching on the surface for meteorites. They've found meteorites from Mars, for instance. And so all kinds of science that goes on, and it's still supported by the military. But there is the Antarctic Treaty that went into place in 1961 that put all territorial claims in abeyance and insisted that the entire continent be preserved for science and for preservation of the wildlife and the resources. And it also says no weapons in Antarctica. So the military is just strictly providing logistical support. Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned the calling card for the man.
Henry Hannon.
What was his last name?
Hannan. And again, if you're interested in that and want to learn a little more about it, go to that Texas Map Society that I mentioned, because I wrote an article. I've been editing the newsletter there for over a decade, and I did an article on that donation of the Henry Hannan maps and quoted some of the letters that he wrote home or his wife wrote to him when he was in Texas. And it's just a fascinating story. All of those historic documents happened in like a 2-year time span. He was active from 1876 to 1878. The last thing was a story that appeared in the local newspaper in Swan Creek, Ohio, how he was thrown from a horse and died. So his career ended early. Yes, sir.
What's your thoughts on climate change?
Yes. It's happening, and we are largely responsible. Now, that's not to say there can't also be some natural fluctuation that's leading to some warming, but if that's the case, we should be doing everything we possibly can to prevent it from getting worse. That's not an excuse not to do anything. I mean, I'm 70. Most of you are, getting close to my age or even older, and it may not affect us so much, but our kids and our grandkids have to live with this climate we're living in. And I think it's vital that we find more and more green sources of energy and wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. There's always going to be a need for fossil fuels, but we don't have to use it for transportation, for instance. You have to use oil in various manufacturing products and so forth. It's not going to go away, but we can vastly cut it down and reduce that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
So is your Tesla parked out there? Is your Tesla parked out there?
I used to drive a Prius. My car out here is Tacoma pickup. Because we own some ranch property down in Bosque County. Now, I've already told the salesman there, when they try to get me to buy a new one, I say, I'm waiting until we get an electric pickup. So that'll probably be our next purchase.
All right, thank you so much.
All right.
This was awesome.